At the time of recording this video, it has just been 85 years since the beginning of World War II in Europe. In this video, we're going to talk about the most important armed conflict of the 20th century. By 1939, when the war began in Europe, the two sides that would face each other had already been taking shape for some years. On one side were the Axis powers, made up mainly of three countries: Germany, led by Adolf Hitler; Italy, where Benito Mussolini had seized power; and the Empire of Japan, whose emperor was Hirohito. This so-called Tokyo-Rome-Berlin axis began forming in 1936, but it would only be solidified after the start of the war with the Tripartite Pact of 1940. Opposing them were the Allies, whose main powers at first were France and England. Many changes would soon take place within this alliance, as we'll see. The leader of Free France would become Charles de Gaulle, and Winston Churchill would be appointed Prime Minister of Great Britain. Two other nations that would later play a key role still had to enter the scene: the United States and the Soviet Union. Now, how did we reach this situation? To understand the road to World War II, we must go back 20 years in time. Most historians agree that the Second World War had its roots in the end of the First, particularly in the 1919 Treaty of Versailles. That treaty had many weaknesses, one of which was how harshly it treated Germany. Germany had to pay enormous reparations, was forced to demilitarize almost completely, and lost thousands of square kilometers of territory. Many Germans saw it as a humiliation. A few years later, Europe seemed to enter a period of growth, and politicians sought peace. But the severe economic crisis of 1929, combined with fear of communism, allowed extremist nationalist movements to gain power. That was the environment Adolf Hitler took advantage of to become chancellor in 1933. From that point on, peace was openly threatened. It took Hitler only 6 years to plunge Europe into a new world war. He began by reinstating compulsory military service in 1935 and rearming the country. Then, in 1938, he managed to annex Austria to Germany and soon after invaded Czechoslovakia. France and England, meanwhile, practiced what became known as the policy of appeasement, trying to avoid or delay war by granting concessions, as they were not ready for conflict given their internal situations. But the limit to this policy would be Poland, Hitler's next target. Before attacking, Germany signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Stalin's Soviet Union in August 1939, a non-aggression agreement that secretly divided Poland between the two powers. Now Hitler had a clear path and became directly responsible for the outbreak of war. On September 1st, German forces invaded Poland, and on the 17th, the Soviets joined in. Britain and France declared war, but by the end of the month, Poland had been defeated. Hitler had begun World War II in Europe, while in Asia, Japan and China had already been fighting for 2 years. Following the fall of Poland came a rapid and violent German expansion. Denmark, Norway, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands were all defeated between April and early June 1940. The next major target was France, Germany's traditional enemy. The French relied on a strong line of fortifications along the German border known as the Maginot Line. Unfortunately, the line ended at the border with Belgium, which the Germans exploited. Belgium and the French defenses quickly collapsed, and German forces broke through, surrounding the Allies. Through the Dunkirk evacuation, British and French troops managed to withdraw more than 300,000 men in what was almost a miracle. But France's fate was already sealed. On June 22nd, an unconditional surrender was signed, dividing the country in two, one part under German control and the other based in Vichy, ruled by Marshal Pétain. Germany had taken its revenge for the Treaty of Versailles. Despite Hitler's hopes, the British, under Winston Churchill, Prime Minister since May, did not surrender. On July 10, 1940, began what we know as the Battle of Britain, a prolonged air campaign between the German Luftwaffe and Britain's Royal Air Force, RAF. For months, Germany bombed England, seeking to gain air superiority. But in the end, on October 31, 1940, victory belonged to the Allies. Even so, German forces continued nighttime bombing raids. Having failed to subdue Britain, Hitler turned his focus to helping Mussolini's Italy in two problematic regions. The first was the Balkans, where Greece resisted Italian attacks. The second, much more complex, was North Africa, which became a new front in the war. In February 1941, General Erwin Rommel, one of the most brilliant strategists of the entire war, was sent there. Rommel and his Africa Corps posed a serious challenge to the Allies, achieving several victories for the Axis. However, these fronts were not Hitler's priority. He dealt with them mainly to remove obstacles before attempting his greatest gamble of the war: the invasion of the Soviet Union. Breaking the Non-Aggression Pact, on June 22, 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, a massive invasion of Soviet territory with 3 simultaneous offensives. He was so confident in his blitzkrieg tactics and his army's superiority that he expected to conquer Moscow before winter. At first, he seemed to be right. The initial invasion was a stunning success. But as winter approached, things changed. By November, when German troops reached Moscow, temperatures were brutally low. Thousands of soldiers died due to inadequate winter gear, and the Soviet counteroffensive managed to save the capital. Hitler then shifted focus to the Caucasus and its vital oil resources. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the situation was also about to change. On December 7, 1941, the Empire of Japan launched a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, the most important American base in the Pacific. The result was a devastating loss of men, aircraft, and warships, and it directly caused the United States to enter the war. In a matter of months, Hitler had gained 2 new enemies, the United States and the Soviet Union, both now part of the Allied powers. At first, Japan dominated the Pacific, seizing vast coastal territories and islands during early 1942. But the Japanese knew they couldn't win a long war against the U.S., so they sought a decisive battle, the Battle of Midway. There, the Americans won, and from that point on, they began reclaiming territory from Japan. In Europe, things were no better for Hitler. His campaign in the Caucasus, known as Operation Blue, led to the Battle of Stalingrad, one of the turning points of the war. The Soviet order was clear: defend the city or die trying. The brutal fighting began on August 23, 1942, and lasted until February 2, 1943. Stalingrad became one of the bloodiest battles in all of human history. The Soviets ultimately triumphed. A few months later came the Battle of Kursk on July 5, 1943, the largest tank battle in history, where Soviet forces defeated Hitler's feared panzers. From then on, Stalin's armies began a massive offensive that would not stop until reaching Berlin itself. Meanwhile, in Italy, the Allies landed in Sicily shortly after the Soviet victory at Kursk. As a result, Mussolini was overthrown and briefly imprisoned by the Italians, who then surrendered. However, the Germans freed him and made him leader of the Italian Social Republic, splitting the country in 2. The Allies, advancing from the south, finally liberated Rome on June 4, 1944. Mussolini fled north but was captured and executed by partisans the following year on April 28, 1945. Hitler's attention, however, was now on the Western Front. On June 6, 1944, 2 days after the fall of Rome, hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers landed on the beaches of Normandy in Operation Overlord. The fighting was especially fierce at Omaha Beach, but the Allies eventually gained a foothold in Western Europe. The success of the Normandy invasion, years in the making, proved decisive for the war's outcome. Within a month and a half, Allied forces liberated Paris. By late 1944, nearly all of France, Belgium, and southern Holland had been freed. At the same time, the Soviet offensive from the east was closing in, shrinking German territory on both fronts. Hitler launched one final counterattack, the Battle of the Bulge, but its failure in January 1945 sealed Nazi Germany's fate. A few months later, with Berlin surrounded by Soviet troops, Hitler committed suicide on April 30, 1945. 7 days later, Germany surrendered to the Western Allies, and 2 days after that, to the Soviets. Only the Pacific theater remained. Japan was cornered but refused to surrender. That changed after August 6, 1945, when the city of Hiroshima was completely destroyed by an American atomic bomb, followed by Nagasaki 3 days later. Japan formally surrendered on September 2, 1945, bringing World War II to an end. Thank you very much for watching this video. If you found it interesting, remember to subscribe to be notified when we upload new ones. Tell us your opinions in the comments and let us know if you'd like us to dedicate future videos to specific moments of the war. For now, we say goodbye, good luck, and see you next time.